Welcome back, students. This is Module 3 of Week 4. We'll be going over Chapter 4 in the book with some additional material that we'll be discussing at the end of the presentation. Module 3 looks at consumer behavior and its effects on natural resources and the environment. It examines consumer decision-making concerning goods and services that they purchase, the quantities they purchase, and how these purchases affect the environment. It explores how prices, incomes, and consumer preferences combine to define goods and services. Societal purchasing decisions are also analyzed to determine if people can be influenced to engage in sustainable consumer behavior. Our course topics for this week are budget constraints, consumer preferences, consumption decisions, social choice and societal decisions, biocentrism, anthropocentrism, and sustainability. According to the theory of demand, consumers will compare the prices of goods and services available on the market, then purchase combinations of these goods and services that best meet their needs and desires. This is all done according to their available incomes. These purchases provide consumers with utility, or well-being. This is the satisfaction a consumer receives from the consumption of the good itself. Individual goods or services are not purchased in isolation. Instead, consumers dispense their income among a number of different goods, and the amount of a good a consumer purchases is affected by the amount of all other goods the consumer purchases. In addition to individual purchases a consumer may make, we need to consider the set of all goods and services that the individual consumes. This is referred to as a consumption bundle. An individual's consumption bundle is the assortment of all the goods and services consumed by that individual. Consumption is based off of an individual's income and is therefore subject to limitations. A budget constraint is the set of all combinations of goods, or a bundle, that the consumer can afford given their income. Or said another way, it is the set of all combinations of goods, again a bundle, that the consumer can purchase with no income remaining. Insufficient funds or lack of income and savings prevents consumers from purchasing all of the goods and services that they desire. Consumers are then forced to make trade-offs among goods and services. Budget constraints can be especially problematic for those in lower incomes, since compromises may have to be made between things that they really need. This results in hardships on the poor or those on low fixed incomes. The bottom line here is that you cannot spend more than you have. On the positive side, constraints can be very beneficial for the earth, since they place budgetary limits on the consumption of certain goods and services that can be environmentally damaging, such as gasoline from oil or electricity derived from coal or natural gas, all of which can result in greenhouse gas emissions. Consumers will always have to make trade-offs between goods and services that they purchase. No one can purchase everything that they want. But what about products of necessity? When consumers are required to spend more on products of necessity, they will have less income to spend on other items if their intention is to stay within their budgets and not go into debt. Consumption patterns for products of necessity generally remain unchanged when prices increase, at least in the short run. Restrictions on purchasing will occur for regular items purchased and for leisure goods purchased. These are not considered items of necessity. Sales and cheaper substitute products will be sought out to help maximizing purchasing power as well. If the problem, however, is long-term or consistently reoccurs, substitutes for the products of necessity will be demanded by consumers. For example, consumers change their expenditures for regularly purchased items, those not of necessity, when gasoline prices have risen quickly or spiked, but purchases for gasoline itself remained relatively unchanged. Even when gas prices doubled, consumers changed the amount of gas they purchased very little. Apparently, people still had to get to work, go to the store, drive their kids to school, etc. But when gas prices remained high for extended periods of time, demand for vehicles with better fuel efficiency emerged, and so did alternative vehicle purchases increase. Unrelated items of necessity, like food, were also affected. As gas prices were increased, consumers were more likely to choose generic brands for food, food items on sale, and cheaper alternatives like chicken instead of beef. As previously mentioned, these changes were especially prevalent among the poor and lower class incomes. Now, what about the environment? Is the environment considered an item of necessity? A budget constraint explains what an individual set of affordable bundles are, but says nothing about which bundles the consumer will choose to purchase. It is an individual's preference that determines the choice of which bundle from among his affordable bundles that will be selected. Preferences also determine how consumers will make trade-offs between goods and services that they intend to purchase. Preferences describe the satisfaction or the happiness that is acquired from consuming goods or services. It's not about the costs that are incurred. We can describe this logically. Any two bundles can be ranked in one of three ways. First, the consumer will prefer bundle A to bundle B. In the second category, the consumer will prefer bundle B to bundle A. And then in the third category, the consumer is indifferent or equally happy consuming either bundle A or bundle B. Remember, everyone is unique, and no two customers will have the same preferences. Preferences are determined by a number of factors, and purely by taste factors mostly. These are culture, family and friends, trends, qualities, advertising, etc. Regarding preference assumptions and assuming rational behavior, there are four assumptions that can be made regarding consumer preferences. The first assumption is that each consumer is consistent in their preferences. Therefore, if a consumer prefers bundle A to bundle B, then he or she will not also prefer bundle B to bundle A. The second assumption is that consumer preferences are logical. If a consumer prefers bundle A to bundle B and prefers bundle B to bundle C, then that consumer will logically also prefer bundle A to bundle C. The third assumption is the more or better concept. Here, a consumer's happiness is increased if he or she receives more of at least one good and not less of any other good. And the final assumption is that consumers will choose the bundles that they prefer. If a consumer prefers bundle A to bundle B, and he or she can afford either bundle, then he or she will choose bundle A. So how do consumers decide how much to consume? Remember that consumers choose the bundle that provides the greatest level of satisfaction from among the bundles that they can afford, and that budget constraints identify the affordable bundles, while consumer preferences represent what consumers prefer to purchase. Let's consider a single item of necessity, such as a utility from a municipal service. It could be electricity or water, it really doesn't matter. Usually the only decisions that consumers will have to face is how much they need to use. However, for most other goods and services, especially items that are not of necessity, the decision becomes far more complex. Some items will have many different characteristics requiring multiple trade-offs. A change in one important characteristic could result in big changes in purchasing decisions, especially if it significantly adds to the price. Consider the purchase of a car. Unlike a municipal service, purchasing a car requires making a number of choices. First, a car is one very large element in a bundle of goods that a consumer might buy. Consumers will have to choose from a wide variety of car characteristics or options. These include the size, safety features, style, fuel efficiency, etc. Trade-offs may be required within the bundle the car finds itself in, and trade-offs will almost certainly occur among all of the available options. Tying this car purchase back to our previous example of rising gas prices, the rapid increase in the price of gas resulted in a significant change in preferences towards fuel efficiency, and with it a greater public awareness of greenhouse gas emissions. Both of these affected car purchasing decisions and led to a decline in large trucks and SUVs in favor of more fuel-efficient varieties. Rational choice theory, or just plain choice theory, sums up the previous slide very well. Choice theory provides a good framework for understanding and even modeling economic and social consumption behavior. The underlying assumption of the theory is once again that consumers will choose the bundle that provides them the greatest satisfaction or happiness from among the bundles that they can afford. And how much to consume is determined by the product's characteristics, which identify the bundles consumers prefer, and the budget constraints which signify the affordable bundles. What is important here is that the ideal consumption levels are at the intersections of these two actions. Thus far, we have been assuming rational behavior in our decision-making processes. But are all consumption decisions really based off of rational thinking? Some decisions are more emotionally based or based off of gut feelings instead of a rational process. When a consumer makes a purchase of a new dress or a sports jacket just because they have to have it, or they buy a brand name for twice as much as the same product, they're basically making an emotional-based purchase. Economics may not be in a position to adequately explain how we make all of our purchasing decisions, and a more in-depth understanding is required from other fields such as psychology, anthropology, biology, neurology, etc., which have come up with four major considerations. The first consideration is that decision-making and choice selection can be very exhausting. The fatigue factor sets in and we get lazy. Decisions tend to be made off of the last available data or the most memorable data. The second consideration is called the paradox of choice. Here, too many choices and we are less likely to make a decision, whereas fewer choices actually make a person more likely to make a purchasing decision. The third is that we're still essentially social animals. We allow our friends, our families, our communities to essentially think for us. Their influence drives our choices. We may be also hardwired at a neurological level in such a way that our preferences are shaped by the status quo, by the systems themselves. The final consideration is called hyperbolic discounting. Here, consumers don't adequately evaluate rewards over time. They prefer rewards now, and if it's a consequence, pain later, and this process is repeated. Decisions themselves may come from two different parts of the brain. The rational choice to delay gratification for a greater reward in the future is processed in the frontal system. The immediate gratifying choice is processed in the limbic system, which is more connected to behavior and reward pathways. And this is a big concern for long-term effects when most of the decisions are made in the short term. When we consider how our consumption decisions affect the environment, we see that the average U.S. citizen is very resource intensive, consuming over 18 tons of natural resources per year. This consumption also generates an even greater volume of waste from the extraction of all of the natural resources, from agriculture, from industrial production, and from businesses and household uses. Most of these wastes are later stored in landfills or incinerated. However, there's a large amount of waste that gets released into the atmosphere or dumped into waterways, thus creating pollution. Very little is actually recycled or reused. Fortunately, this is starting to change. The problem that we're running into is that economic development for the developing world, which constitutes the bulk of the world's population, wants their chance at mass consumption as well. As populations and purchasing powers increase worldwide, resources are going to be overused. Some examples of overuse include desired spaces for living, more miles traveled, more food that ends up actually as waste, and more water consumption. As we learned in our class on supply and demand, prices can play a significant role in consumption and its effects on the environment and in natural resource selection. A change in the price of a good or service will result in a change in the quantity demanded of that good or service and can change the quantity demanded of other goods as well. Therefore, higher prices will result in reduced consumption of a good or service and can reduce the consumption of other goods as well. Please note that the change in the price of a good of necessity will almost always result in a much lower change in the quantity demanded than if it was a regular item. A lower price will have the opposite effect, usually resulting in an increase in consumption. Finally, a sustained increase in price, sustained meaning over a long period of time, even if it's an item of necessity, will result in a consumption decrease of both that good or service and other related items. This can be a very powerful tool to combat environmental damage or climate change. Consider an increase in a utility cost for electricity that results from a carbon tax. The utility company will generally pass on this extra cost to the consumer. Initially, this might only cause a minor decrease in electricity, accompanied by more significant decreases in other items, since people have to use electricity. The biggest decrease will come from items that are not of necessity, but in time a new equilibrium point will be reached, resulting in less consumption all the way around, including consumption of electricity, and this will be determined by the consumer's affordability. The positive effect is environmental, resulting in a reduction in electricity demand and less greenhouse gas emissions, and an implementation of conservation measures by both businesses and householders. The negative result, however, is financial hardship on consumers themselves, especially those in lower income brackets. Changes in consumer incomes can have a similar effect on consumption. When a consumer's income increases, the common reaction is to purchase more goods, thus leading to more consumption. The opposite is true for a decrease in income. An increase in income doesn't necessarily mean an increase in all goods and services the consumer purchases. It could cause consumption of one good to increase and the consumption of another good to decline, especially if that good is considered inferior, since the consumer can now afford better quality. Incomes have increased worldwide, and with it an increase in pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from all of the additional consumption. As resource-intensive middle classes increase throughout the developing world, we are witnessing a greater demand for energy, city expansion, bigger cars and homes, and meat consumption. Without better conservation, new technologies, and alternative energy sources and different materials, this demand could reach an unsustainable expectation. As already mentioned, consumers have different preferences resulting from different consumer tastes and purchasing choices. Consumer preferences generally differ according to the following factors. The first is their social and cultural factors. Next is their purchasing power, their lifestyles, and brand preferences. Then their purchasing locations, whether they choose to buy online or from high-end stores or wherever. And finally is their views on corporate social responsibility programs with the companies that they purchase from. Consumers in modern society are becoming very sensitive to environmental problems and the actions of large and even small corporations. This consumer awareness has resulted in corporate social responsibility programs in a number of companies and is becoming a crucial component in their strategy and policy development. As more greenhouse gases are emitted, it's going to cause a greater regional destabilization from climate change. And as more pollution gets released, there will be further increases in ecosystem damage and healthcare costs incurred by both consumers and governments. Preferences will further change simply out of necessity. We have thus far been talking about the consumption and demand for individuals. Sometimes it's helpful to understand the total demand of all consumers. A demand curve for a group of people is called an aggregate demand curve. It is acquired by adding up the demand curves of all of the individuals in the sample. This is our formula. Here, Q1 times the price is the demand curve for the first individual, and it's added to Q2 times the price, or the demand curve for the second individual, and so on until we get the total aggregate demand. The process is then repeated for other prices. The aggregate demand curve can be very useful, even more so than individual demand curves. When averaged and divided by the total population, it can be used to estimate the general effect of like prices, of incomes, or of preferences on quantities, and how these changes and the factors determine consumer demand. For our last slide that deals with Chapter 4, we'll look at an example out of the book. The book describes how greenhouse gas emissions were successfully reduced in European Union countries where carbon taxes were imposed on households and industries. They use the example of Denmark. Greenhouse gas emissions from energy-related industries fell 1.7% from 1990 to 2004 and 19.1% for residential and commercial energy use. Part of the reason for this stark difference has to do with efficiencies. Industries are always concerned about keeping their costs low and adherence to regulation changes that affect their bottom line, their profits. So over the years, they have been working on lowering their emissions and becoming extremely efficient. Households and commercial buildings did not start making serious changes until the new taxes came in and the prices increased. These carbon-related taxes increased the price of electricity. As a result, people and businesses began to consume over time less energy and emitted over time less greenhouse gases. However, this reduction came at a cost to consumers who had to pay higher prices for energy and had to pay higher energy conservation measure prices to get more efficient lighting, heat pumps, and insulations, etc., put into their homes to help offset these higher prices. Many consumers had to forego spending in other areas considerably, and they even had to reduce some spending in some items of necessity. In the case of lower income families, many simply could not afford the use of as much energy as they had grown accustomed to and had to deal with the discomfort that it caused. There were some government incentives and subsidies that helped homeowners and businesses adapt to these new costs and reduce some of the pressures. What this demonstrated and this success represented to European countries has led to a new European Union initiative to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. In addition, there is a goal to achieve a 27% share of energy consumption from the use of renewable energy sources and to increase energy efficiency by 27%, all very amiable measures. Let's now discuss societal decisions. There are two basic questions in environmental or natural resource economics. The first is, what is the right balance between environmental protection and environmental or natural resource use? The second is, how do we encourage economic agents, mainly industry and special interests, to use the environment in a fashion that is determined desirable or at least not damaging? For example, how much land should be set aside to protect an endangered species versus land that's put aside for land development or resource extraction? And what level of air pollution should be considered acceptable? The key issue in all of these questions is that they involve societal decisions. Social choice theory attempts to address this issue, and we'll go into social choice theory only briefly here. Social choice theory combines individual opinions, preferences, and interests in such a way as to reach a collective decision. Or said another way, it combines their individual welfares in such a way as to reach a collective social welfare. It aggregates or sums up individual preferences into a social welfare function. Social choice reflects many individuals' preferences, some of who care deeply about the environment and some of who don't care about it at all. It attempts to translate diverse individual preferences regarding the environment into a group or a societal choice, and to find a way to translate every individual opinion, regardless of how different or strange it may seem, into an appropriate environmental policy. Since collective societal or social choice is derived from individual choices, it helps to understand the drivers behind individual preferences regarding the environment. There are many different views on what is right or moral regarding the environment. There are, however, three broad categories of preferences. The first is biocentrism, the second, anthropocentrism, the third, sustainability. Biocentrism, or ecocentrism, stresses the intrinsic or naturally occurring rather than instrumental value of the environment and places the biological world, primarily that of non-humans, at the center of its value system. It endorses the preservation of the environment, its biodiversity, and animal rights above all other things. In pure biocentrism, the agent will never trade a material good, in this case we'll call it X, for an environmental good, or E. Some elements of biocentrism combine deep ecology with an anti-industrial and anti-capitalist position. This far-left position fails to address the economic need of an advanced society. Anthropocentrism is almost the exact opposite of biocentrism. Here the environment serves only one purpose, and that purpose is to provide material gratification for humans. The strictest definition of anthropocentrism is that it places instrumental or material values on the environment. For example, a local indigenous animal like a sparrow would be of no use to humans, therefore it would have no value. In pure anthropocentrism, the agent will never trade the environment, E, for a material good, X. Anthropocentrism is the reason why humanity, or at least much of humanity, feels the need to develop most of the earth. This belief is believed by many to also be the primary problem that is leading to environmental degradation, and it's centered around the traditional Western attitude towards the non-human world. The final category is sustainability, and sustainability means many different things to many different people. The concept can be traced back to Aldo Leopold's land ethic idea, where he argued that it is the health of an ecosystem that is of paramount importance, and that environmental policy is right if it preserves the integrity of an ecosystem, and basically wrong if it does not. The World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, attempted to define sustainability in a much clearer way. It said that it is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainability represents the capacity to endure. It realizes that healthy ecosystems and environments are necessary if humans and other organisms hope to survive. Recognizing that economic development, social development, and environmental protection are not mutually exclusive, but are instead mutually reinforcing. This type of thinking represents the type of individual and in turn social preferences and choices we as societies should be making and navigating towards, since it best preserves our long-term prospects and interests. This all leads us into sustainable consumer behavior, where the consumer's behavior improves societal and environmental performance while still meeting their own needs and desires. Conventional consumer behavior is focused on purchasing goods and services and the transfer of ownership of products, the sale. It's heavily influenced through marketing and profit maximization. Sustainable consumer behavior, on the other hand, considers the social and environmental effects. It looks at all stages of the consumption project, which include the individual's needs and wants, how they search and evaluate the products or services, comparison to other alternatives, the purchase, and the product of use, and also its post-use as part of their overall decision-making capabilities.